Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chasovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Milos, it's been another very eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
This week, the conflict in Iran intensified as the U.S. bombed military facilities on Iran's Kharg island, while key energy facilities were attacked by Israel and Iran, as well as Israel committing troops for a possible ground invasion of Lebanon. Shifting to the Indo-Pacific, U.S. President Trump formally postponed an upcoming meeting with President Xi Jinping by a month in light of the Iran conflict, and Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is visiting Washington as we speak for talks with President Trump. In Europe, Ukraine signed an agreement with the United Kingdom focusing on defense industry cooperation, while Turkey stated it was willing to host a new round of negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. And then finally, in the Americas, the U.S. continued its pressure campaign on Cuba, as Trump suggested that he wanted to, quote, take the island, while Russia pledged to deliver oil to the island as the U.S. blockade causes island-wide blackouts. So lots to get into, as usual.
Yeah, thanks, Milos. So let's start off, as we have been in recent weeks, with the Middle East and in particular the ongoing conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. So Andrew, starting off, let's get a military update on what we've been seeing over the past week.
Yeah, so Israel is definitely continuing its strategy of decapitation, essentially, of the Iranian government. A number of key leaders were taken out really within a 48-hour time period this week, including the Iranian intelligence minister, most recently Ismail Khatib, the secretary of the National Security Council, and also the man who was presumed to be running the country in this current crisis scenario immediately following the Supreme Leader's death in the opening hours of the war, Ali Larijani, and then also the head of the Basij paramilitary forces, General Gholam Reza Soleimani. Speaking of senior Iranian officials, the newly appointed Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei, who, of course, I will remind listeners, is the previous Supreme Leader's son, rejected ceasefire proposals that were brought to the Iranian Foreign Ministry by two different intermediaries. This is according to reporting from an unnamed senior Iranian official. There are currently no details publicly available of what those terms may have been for a ceasefire proposal. And we don't know either what country had proposed them. We only know for certain that the Supreme Leader turned them down, apparently quite aggressively in a rough manner, quoting the article there, and vowed to, quote, bring the U.S. to their knees before peace was possible. Trump is also said to be weighing the deployment of additional thousands of American troops to support the war effort in Iran. Currently, the 31st MU, that's the Marine Expeditionary Unit, has been redeployed from where it is currently headquartered in its forward deployed position out of Okinawa to support the American war effort in the Persian Gulf. We don't know exactly what the objective either of the MU or any additional American ground forces deployed to the region might be, at least initially. Some speculation indicates that it could be to seize and occupy Kharg Island or Iranian shoreline. We don't have time right now to weigh into either the wisdom or the folly of that. I'll just point out that something like the 31st MU is doctrinally perfect for that sort of objective. Now, what happens the day after the island is taken, just as an example, is a completely different conversation. That's the latest on that, however. And then finally, and perhaps most significantly, in terms of escalation at least, the U.S. conducted a significant bombing campaign against Iranian military positions on Kharg Island. The island, of course, is Iran's main oil export hub in the Persian Gulf. It is critical for the Iranian government. In this recent attack, the U.S. did spare Iranian oil infrastructure on the island, but Trump threatened to attack it in follow-on rounds of strikes if the Iranians refuse to open the Strait of Hormuz.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. And kind of picking up on that point, in addition to all of those kinetic and military developments that you've mentioned, there's been a significant escalation when it comes to the hybrid sphere, in particular, attacks against energy infrastructure, both by Israel as well as by Iran. So one notable development from this week was that Israel conducted airstrikes against energy infrastructure in the South Pars gas field, which is a major offshore gas reservoir in the Persian Gulf belonging to Iran. And then Iran retaliated, recently, and I should note that we are recording this on Thursday, March 19th, by escalating its attacks against energy infrastructure of various Gulf states. And this includes hitting a major liquefied natural gas facility in Qatar, as well as 2 Kuwaiti oil refineries. So this is something that has sparked, quite a lot of concern, not least among of which is U.S. President Trump, who claimed on social media that Qatar had no knowledge of the attacks, and here I'm referring to the Israeli attacks against Iranian energy infrastructure, and nor was it involved. And he even kind of put pressure saying that Israel would not conduct another attack unless Iran attacked Qatar in a major way. So that did not prevent Iran from taking that action. This follows our close monitoring of the impact of the conflict on global energy markets, where we've seen basically gas prices, in terms of natural gas, for example, in Europe, increasing by more than 50%. Oil prices, global oil prices have increased quite dramatically. In this past week, they've ranged between $100 a barrel to sometimes even close to $120 a barrel. Just as an example of some of the disruption that we've seen is the effective continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main artery of energy exports, not only of Iran, but also countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And we've seen, for example, the UAE having to reduce its oil output by more than half, from nearly 3.5 million barrels in February to 1.5 million barrels per day currently. So we're seeing that oil shock and that energy shock continue. There's been a lot of responses to this, including EU energy ministers holding emergency meetings to protect consumers from rising gas and oil prices amid this ongoing war. Obviously, that's been a major political issue here in the U.S. as well, in terms of the impact of not only rising gas prices, but the follow-on effects on everything from agriculture to fertilizers to machinery and other equipment. So this is definitely something that is continuing to have a major impact and continues, at least as of this week, to escalate in terms of its hybrid and energy impact. So we'll definitely keep tracking that and update in the next episode. And before we leave the Middle East, Andrew, turning back to you here, if you could just update us on a related theater, adjacent to the Iranian conflict, which is the Israel-Lebanon conflict, and what we're seeing there this past week.
Yeah, there's a lot of reporting out there that's describing the current war between Israel and Hezbollah as, quote, a war within a war, of course, referencing the broader war between Israel and the United States and Iran. But it is, without question, an extension of that conflict and perhaps the point of most significant escalation, at least in the region right now, that we're tracking. So the latest out of Lebanon is that Israel has committed additional ground troops, at least an additional division in southern Lebanon, almost certainly indicating that they are preparing for a larger, more aggressive ground push into southern Lebanese territory, perhaps all the way up to the Litani River. And again, that's something else that's very critical, but we can perhaps discuss that in more detail in a future episode. Along with that, of course, the Israelis have also continued to escalate again, both the geographic scope and the intensity of their air campaign, simply in terms of the number of strikes occurring daily, including in Beirut itself, including neighborhoods of Beirut that historically the Israelis have left out of the fighting, at least to this extent. Currently, at least 900 people have been killed inside Lebanon and over 1 million displaced since March 2nd, when Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel, kicking off this latest round of conflict. And then on that note, Hezbollah has consistently fired rockets into northern Israel since March 2nd, although the latest I've seen, and I say this with caution because, of course, this kind of thing could change at any moment, but there have not been any Israeli fatalities reported specifically from those attacks at this time.
Got it. And just one other thing that I wanted to mention, going back to the Iranian theater, notable development from this week was Trump basically calling on U.S., NATO, and European allies, as well as some allies out of the Indo-Pacific theater, to form a joint naval force to contribute to security operations in the Strait of Hormuz, especially as that's been effectively closed by the IRGC. However, no allies of the U.S. have yet to agree to enter into this proposed coalition, so definitely something to keep track of there as well. But in the meantime, let's now pivot to our second global hotspot, which is the Indo-Pacific. And something that you already mentioned up top, Milos, was the impact of the U.S.-Iran war on some planned negotiations and planned meeting between the U.S. and China, as well as some related ripple effects on places like Taiwan. So what can you update us on those fronts?
Yes, indeed. So we are seeing, as you mentioned, some of the effects of this war. And in this particular case, the impact has been on planned negotiations between the United States and China. So Trump and President Xi from China were supposed to have this summit at the end of March, early April, which was going to be their second time meeting since Trump came back into office. It was going to be a bit of a reset in ties, and especially as it relates to trade. It turns out that has now been postponed at President Trump's request by a month, which would set the new date to the end of April. And initially that did raise a few eyebrows, but, looking a bit deeper, this clearly is because of the ongoing conflict in Iran, which Trump, it seems, does not want to interfere in the trade talks with China, China obviously being a key partner to Iran. For the most part, this has been received without too much negativity. Certainly on the Chinese side, this was hailed as a potentially positive development, as from their side, they weren't quite sure exactly what the American side was really hoping to achieve with the summit. And it would also give them a bit more time to process their response to the recently announced new trade investigations from the US's side. So it could be that this postponement actually results in a more substantial delivery of results when the summit ultimately happens in April. But it should be said that this didn't stop negotiations continuing at a lower level prior to the request. So last weekend, actually, we saw a meeting in Paris between the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with the Chinese Vice Premier. Both of them there initially to set the scene for the summit, but obviously in the meantime plans have changed somewhat. But the outlook on that was also fairly positive. Both sides came out of that meeting hailing the trade relations between China and the United States as stable. And both sides seemingly open to expanding exports to one another, specifically on the agricultural side from the United States, as well as aircraft, commercial aircraft to China. Both sides also reportedly explored the establishment of a new instrument of negotiation, dubbed the Board of Trade, which it would be a high-level way for trade officials of both countries to lower barriers on the trade sector, on the political sector, for sensitive sectors, though it should be said that details still remain scarce at this time. And just to round this story up, it's just interesting to note as you mentioned, the impact of the war on the region as a whole. And China has been busy not only with, reacting to the US's outreach, but also it's done some outreach of its own specifically to Taiwan, where China offered to export LNG as well as other forms of energy to the island. And this is notable because Taiwan currently does not import any energy from China, mostly as a way to safeguard its own energy security. But it does import most of its energy from the Middle East, and obviously those supply routes have been gravely affected over the past couple of weeks. So this outreach is notable. It is seen as an effort by Beijing to unify, its broader efforts to unify with the island. We haven't gotten an official response from the Taiwanese government as of yet, but this was preceded by news that Taiwan had secured enough stockpiles, including from the United States, to last at least until June, with talks already being planned with the United States for renewal. So just all things to keep an eye on, and certainly looking at how the impacts of the war are spreading beyond just the Middle East.
Right. And amid this delay in the U.S.-China diplomatic meeting, we have seen some notable encounters between Japan and the U.S. this week. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so unfortunately, as you mentioned, we are recording this on Thursday morning, which is the day that the Japanese Prime Minister is set to meet with President Trump in Washington. So we are unable to analyze the results of this meeting. But what we know about what was planned, for a start, both leaders seem to get along very well, with Trump repeatedly praising Takaichi as a good leader of Japan, and herself saying that she wants to continue having close ties with the United States. We know that on the docket for what was supposed to be talked about, both leaders are set to agree on joint development of rare earths, as well as lithium and copper, and the overall strengthening of the supply chains of critical minerals with one another, as both are trying to diversify their supply away from China. We also know that this week we've gotten a few sort of commitments from Japan to invest further in U.S. critical sectors, especially in the nuclear front, and this is part of the overall trade agreement that was signed last year. And a side note there, interesting to point out that Japan seems for the moment to be committed to honoring the terms of that agreement, despite the recent Supreme Court decision to annul the IEEPA tariffs, something that we covered in previous episodes. And not all countries seem to be going down this road. Just as a quick aside, Malaysia was one of the countries this week to essentially consider the trade agreement with the United States null and void. And it seems to be that a lot of countries are currently trying to figure out which road they want to go down. But anyways, Japan seems to be keen on keeping good relations with the United States. But one thing that is going to be the main cause of uncertainty is whether Trump is going to demand increased participation by Japan in resolving the conflict in Iran, something that you mentioned when covering the Middle East. And at the moment, and all the statements that we've seen coming out of Japan point to the fact that they do not want to get militarily involved, mostly because their own law sort of forbids them from employing the use of military force abroad, save for very few possibilities of that being used. But it seems that there's a lot of legal framework that they've got to get through before making a decision. Japan does have diplomatic relations with Tehran. They do have an embassy there. So it could be that Trump will push for some increased form of diplomatic mediation from Japan. But it is unclear what results we will see from that. So we can expect something to come out of it as early as this afternoon and tomorrow morning. So definitely all things to be keeping an eye on.
Gotcha. And just very briefly, there's been some notable activity out of the Korean peninsula as well. What can you update us there?
Yeah, the main activity here being that North Korea did launch a reported 10 or more ballistic missiles into the sea. Some of them coming quite close to the Japanese exclusive economic zone, though without going in it. And this is in response to joint military drills between the United States and South Korea. These are annual drills planned in advance. But it is interesting as it comes as Trump expressed last week a renewed desire to organize a summit with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. So interesting posturing being put forth by Pyongyang there. And overall, it is going to be an interesting area or center of gravity to keep an eye on with regards to the Indo-Pacific, as not only Trump has made his own overtures to Kim Jong-un, as I just mentioned, but also China has been quite keen to reestablish good connections, even on the infrastructural side, between China and North Korea. And given the diversion of the focus by the United States to the Middle East now, it's certainly going to be interesting to see whether or not China uses the opportunity to perhaps test the United States in the area, possibly even using North Korea as a proxy. So, these kind of ballistic missile tests are definitely worth keeping an eye on. And yeah, we will be doing so moving forward.
Got it. So let's move on to our final global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So turning back to you here, Andrew, what can you update us on from the military side of things?
Yeah, so a very interesting story that we've been keeping our eye on is the Ukrainian response to the war in the Middle East more broadly. Almost as soon as the war started and then Iran retaliated against their Gulf neighbors, there were requests to the Ukrainians and to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry for both technical and tactical aid and bolstering these countries' counter-drone, counter-UAS capabilities. So Zelensky recently said that Ukraine has deployed exactly 201 drone specialists to the Middle East, to various Gulf states, to bolster their own efforts. Of course, the Ukrainians will try to maneuver this diplomatically and for aid towards their own war effort on the home front. On that note, Ukraine and the UK signed a defense agreement 2 days ago on March 17th when Zelensky traveled to London and met with Keir Starmer. That is focused primarily on drones and defense industry cooperation. On a similar note, Spain announced a $1.2 billion aid package for Ukraine, also again focused primarily on expanding the defense industry cooperation between those two countries. Now, this is significant, right, for Ukraine's war effort. This sort of thing is critical, especially as the United States pours more resources into its own war effort in the Middle East. These, while meaningful, these updates do not represent an escalation in and of themselves. And then looking now on the ground in Ukraine, Russian forces have claimed the capture of a single village in Ukraine's Sumy region. Sumy is one of these parts of Ukraine where there are frequent reports about back and forth exchanges of terrain, of territory, and of population centers at significant cost to the armies fighting for them on the ground. So, of course, that the actual situation on the ground in Ukrainian cities and against Ukrainian infrastructure continues. Turning now to diplomatic news, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has recently told his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, that Turkey is ready to host new rounds of negotiations. Again, meaningful, but we have not seen any signal out of Washington so far since the start of the war with Iran that it is ready or interested in resuming high-level negotiations over Ukraine. And then I'll just remind listeners that just before the start of the war in Iran on February 28th, the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine were in the process of planning trilateral talks, which Zelensky himself seemed confident could lead to a meeting between him, Trump, and Putin. That, of course, is off the table for the time being. Interesting news from Ukraine's allies in Europe. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever has called for an end to the war, essentially for Europe to pursue a peace deal directly with Russia. to normalize relations with Russia, and all of this, of course, being in the interest of regaining access to cheap energy. That headline caused quite a stir amongst Ukraine's European allies, many of whom, including other senior Belgian officials, quickly and publicly distanced themselves from the prime minister's remarks. And then finally, also significantly, the EU has offered financial and technical support to repair a pipeline inside of Ukraine that has been damaged in the past from Russian fire. This particular pipeline delivers Russian crude oil to Hungary. For obvious reasons, the Ukrainians have been very reticent to repair the pipeline. The Hungarians, for their part, have essentially retaliated legislatively inside the European Union, where they have been blocking EU aid initiatives to Ukraine, as well as new sanctions packages against Moscow that are currently on the table. So the EU at large right now is trying to both pressure and sweeten the deal for Ukraine to repair this pipeline, at the same time trying to get the Hungarians to relent on their long-standing blockage of aid efforts to Ukraine from the EU.
Right. So yeah, some pretty significant kind of developments and implications there, as you note, Andrew, especially tied to the Europeans, or at least select countries like Hungary and even to some extent Belgium, or at least its prime minister, to sort of reevaluate relations with Russia in light of the current energy crisis that we're experiencing as a result of the war in Iran. I should also note there's been some broader ripple effects when it comes to this issue in terms of countries reevaluating their position and maybe kind of considering relations with Russia in light of this energy crisis. For example, South Korea this week was reportedly exploring the possibility of buying oil from Russia for the first time in 3 years. And this actually comes as other countries, including the Philippines and Thailand, have also indicated similar plans, as that conflict in Iran is inflicting a heavy toll on Asian oil supplies. So that's something to watch for, as those energy ripple effects could redraw some of those diplomatic relationships. And kind of on the flip side, and tying in some developments closer to home here in the U.S. and the Americas, we've seen that Cuba has been under increasing strain from an energy perspective, with its electricity grid having collapsed on Monday. This caused widespread blackouts, and this is, I should note, amid the ongoing U.S. oil blockade against the island, which has been in place for the past few weeks. Now, notably, Russia has kind of inserted itself here and has reportedly sent over 700,000 barrels of oil to Cuba on a sanctioned tanker, and that those oil supplies, around, as I said, over 700,000 barrels of crude, is currently en route to the island. It's reportedly set to arrive there by March 23rd, so at some point next week. And we're seeing this as potentially a challenge out of Russia to the Trump administration, which I should note this week that despite some negotiations that are happening between the U.S. and Cuba, Trump did refuse to rule out military operations against the island. And, as Milos mentioned up top in the podcast, he even, proposed taking, quote unquote, Cuba in some form, although it's unclear exactly what that is. With the Trump administration reiterating the need to remove the current president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, from power before leaving it to Cubans to ensure adequate governance, at least according to that administration. So we're seeing both the energy and diplomatic dynamics start to really ripple out in all corners of the world related to not only the Middle East conflict, but all of the major players like Russia and China. But that's about all that we have time for this week. Before we wrap up, Milos, were there any quick hits that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I just wanted to draw quick attention to another conflict going on at the moment, which we've covered before, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where Pakistan continued its airstrike campaign this week against Afghanistan. This week in particular, striking a drug rehabilitation center in Kabul, which resulted in at least 75 people killed, many of which being adolescents. This brings the total death count to at least 274 people since Islamabad declared an open war, to quote them, against the Taliban regime. And I should note that there have been efforts to mediate the conflict, in particular by China, but so far they have failed to deliver concrete results. And on its part, the United States has given its approval to Pakistan's rights to self-defense, saying this in light of its conflict with terrorist groups, both within its territory and hosted by the Taliban. And I should mention that the Taliban spokesperson has stated that the regime would retaliate in kind. So we are keeping an eye on that hotspot there. And then briefly turning quickly to legal developments in Kazakhstan, where a referendum on constitutional reform has passed with 87% of the votes in favor, with quite a large voter turnout of 73%. As a result of this, the country will be abolishing the bicameral legislature and replacing it with a unicameral parliament. And also enshrines Kazakh as the official state language, as opposed to how it currently is, a language on official footing with Russian. So obviously it's been hailed as positive by the Kazakh populace as a whole, but critics have warned that this could risk enabling government crackdown on dissenting voices. So just a watch item there going forward.
Great. So we'll have to leave it there for now. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.